Hello and welcome to another episode of creating an underwater survival game like Subnautica. This is part 11. In this episode, we'll be creating gear for the player, such as oxygen tanks, dive suits, and flippers, and also we'll be creating a gear equipping system so that the player can equip and unequip gear. Let's get right into it. First of all, let's do some setup for the scene. First, I'm going to move the terrain asset to the terrain folder. So this asset here, I'm just going to move it to the terrain folder so that it's kept properly. After that, I'm going to adjust the camera's field of view. I'm going to make the field of view 53 so that it's a bit wider and you can see more of the screen. After that, I'll just apply this to the camera, to the player prefab. We didn't change anything in the camera underwater script, but we didn't apply it to the player prefab, so I'll just do that. The next thing we're going to do in this episode is we're going to download the assets we need to create the gear as well as the gear menu. So what we're going to do, we're going to need three different things. First are the free gear 3D models that I found online. Then we're going to need sprites of each of those models so that we can put them in its scriptable object. And then after that, we're going to need some UI sprites for the gear menu. So we're going to install all three of those. First, we have the gear sprite sheet for the UI. So this here is just a couple of UI menu icons for the gear menu. So we're just going to set the basic settings for the sprite. Automatically slice it so that we have all of the gear icons. Then we're going to add the item sprites for the free assets I found. Same thing with the sprite settings. And then lastly, I'm going to go to external assets and I'm going to add in the assets that I found. So I'll just make a folder here called gear. And in here, I'll just put in these assets. So here we have a diving helmet. Then I found this t-shirt model because it was the closest thing I could get to like a suit. We also have a tank model for the oxygen tank. You'll also get this pop-up where it says the material is using the texture as a normal map. So we can ignore that for now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up the gear scriptable objects in prefabs. So first up, we need to edit this item scriptable object script. And then I'm going to find the item scriptable object script. And then we open it up. Here we're going to leave everything the same, but we're going to create a new item category called gear. Okay, so now that we added gear to the item scriptable object, we're going to make a class that inherits from item scriptable object so that we can add more code to allow the gear to be distinguished based on like what kind of gear it is. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call it scriptable objects. I'm going to move item scriptable object into scriptable objects. Then I'm going to open up scriptable objects and create a new script. This script is going to be called gear scriptable object. So what we're going to do first is to head over to item scriptable object, and then we're just going to copy the create asset menu function. But in this case, it's not going to be item scriptable object, it's going to be gear scriptable object. And the order will be 2. This allows us to create a gear scriptable object when you're in the editor. And then here, instead of inheriting from mono behavior, we'll inherit from item scriptable object. So the main thing that's going to be different about the gear scriptable object is that all of them will be set to gear, but also we're going to split the gear into separate categories. For example, body, helmet, flipper, tanks, and upgrades. So This is to allow equipping and unequipping of gear properly. So we're going to create a new enum called gear categories, and we're going to write down all of the different categories the gear can be. Then we just need to have a public gear categories. And then after that, we're actually going to put a function called onValidate. And whenever like the gear type is updated, it will allow us to run some code. So private void onValidate. So for the gear scriptable objects, each gear category has its own size because all gear of the same category will be the same type, will be the same size. So for example, the body gear will always be 3x3 size. Helmets will be 2x2 size. Flippers will be 2x2 size. Tanks will actually be 2x3 size. And then upgrades are always 1x1. So on validate, we're just going to set the size of the object, the item scriptable size of the object based on what gear type, what gear category it is in. And then the last thing we want, we know that if we go to item scriptable object, we have an item type and an enum for item categories. We know that if we create a gear scriptable object, the item type will always be gear. So what we're going to do is on reset, we're going to set the item type to be gear because it can't be any other item type. So with this, we can create the scriptable objects and prefabs for the gears. What I'm going to do is go over to scriptable objects folder, and then we'll also create a new folder for gear. Then here we can start creating our new scriptable objects, and it will be a gear scriptable object. So as you all know how to create scriptable objects, I'll just time-lapse this part. Okay, we finished setting up the gear scriptable objects. The next thing we need to do is to actually create the gear menu UI. So to explain, the gear menu is an extension of the inventory system. The gear menu will actually be open whenever the inventory is open, and will appear on the right side. For example, if we click play and we press tab, you see the inventory is on the left side, and on the right side we have nothing. We're going to create the gear menu and display it here whenever the inventory menu is open. And then all of the gear menu functions will be under the inventory system script. So let's create the UI. Also, one more thing to note, you saw an error just on my console. Just remember that whenever you create a new scene, you're going to need an event system. And this event system will need the extended standalone input module that we made before. So don't forget to add that. So you see if I click now, the error won't reappear because we were missing the extended standalone input module. Anyways, back to the gear menu. So if you recall, we have sprites for the gear menu buttons. The first thing I'm going to do is to open up menus, and I'm going to create a new empty game object. Oh, actually, I'm going to create a new image. So this image will actually be a stretched image, but it will also be on the right side of the screen. So here you see we have the right side of the screen, we have a stretch image. I'm holding down Shift and Alternate to make sure the anchor is put properly. We'll set the position to 0 as always, and then we'll actually we can go ahead and look at the item. I can turn on the inventory menu for comparison. This image will name it gear menu. However, it won't have its own system like the other menus. It will be connected to the inventory system. I'll change the color to the same as the inventory system, and here the width approximately the same size as the inventory menu. So I'll just copy paste this actually. Then I'm going to create the buttons which will actually display what gear you have equipped. So another UI image, and I'm going to call this gear slot. Gear slot will be white, and here we'll use gear sprite sheet 1. So this will be the button that displays the body gear type. So this will be 200 by 200, just to set the scale right, and it will be in the center of the menu. So on the gear slot, we're just going to add a button, and the button will actually not have any text or any image, because the image is going to be set in code in the scripts. So this button will match the size of the gear slot, and later on we'll set the onClick to a function we're going to create later. Remember that the button should appear above the gear slot so that when we set the sprite, it actually shows up over the gear slot icon that we did over here. So now we're just going to duplicate these until we have 5 slots, or until we have 6 slots actually. So a total of 6, because we'll have 2 upgrade slots, 1 for each gear type, except for upgrade slots, which will have 2. So I'll just do another time lapse for the menu setup. So here we have our gear menu. We'll set the button functions later, but for now we can just turn it off and add it to the game manager prefab. We'll later make a reference to it with the inventory so that it can activate when the inventory is activated. Your gear menu should look a little something like this. Okay, next up, we're going to start working on the inventory system code. So all of the code for the gear system functions will be in the inventory system. What we're going to do is that we're going to create a new region in there for our new functions for equipping and unequipping gear, and then we'll tweak some of the older code to accommodate the gear system. So let's start off by opening our inventory system. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add in all of the new gear system functions. So we'll start off at our variables, and here we'll add a new header for gear slots. So in our inventory system, we're going to keep track of a list of gear scriptable objects. This list helps keep track of what gear is currently equipped, and each slot will be for a specific type of gear. One will be for the body, one for helmet gear, one for flipper type gears, tank and upgrade slots, so on and so forth. Then we're going to also need references to the gear menu, which we will turn on and off whenever we open the inventory. And also we will need a list of the gear slot UI. So remember in the menu we made, we have the buttons, which will have images, and that image will change based on what gear is equipped. So we need to keep track of those. After that, we're actually going to add 2 more variables. One will be a delegate, and one will actually be an event. So we're adding these so that we can set up an event such that whenever the inventory is updated, we can have different codes that subscribe. We can have some different scripts subscribe to this event and run code whenever the inventory is updated. This will be good for future code where some things will need to happen whenever the inventory gets updated. So yeah, we're going to create that event. Next up, I'm just going to minus off all of the other regions we have so as to make it neater. Yeah, you see all of our regions are minus so that it appears smaller. We open them up to see them again, but yeah. I'm going to create a new region called Gear Equipping Functions. So the first function I'm going to make is the setGear function. This will take in a gear scriptable object and an integer. So this setGear function, basically, what it does is it takes the gear and the gear int that it's given, sets the gear in the gear slots list, and then displays the UI for the gear slot. So let's write this function out. First, if it's the same gear, then we won't set anything. After that, we set the gear in the slot, then we update the gear UI. So I'm going to make a reference to the current image for the gear slot in question, and then we'll check if the gear is null. So if it is, then we will just turn off the game object. But if it isn't, we'll turn on the game object and set the sprite. The next function we're going to create is the unequipped gear function. So this will be the function that is on the gear menu buttons, and basically whenever you click on the gear menu button back in the gear UI, it basically takes the gear from that slot and then it turns off the button, unsets the gear, and then adds it back to the inventory. This will be how we unequip gear. This function takes in the gear int so it knows which slot to unequip. So what we're going to do here is we're going to check if the inventory has space and if we can add the item back into the inventory. And then if we do, we set the gear to null after we add it back. But if we can't add the item back, then we do nothing. So we do this by using the add item function, and if it returns true, that means we added in the item and we can set the gear to null. But if it returns false, then we can just do nothing. The last function we're going to make is the equip gear function. So this function will have all of the logic for equipping gear. For example, if the gear slot is already empty and you equip the gear, then we can set it, no problem. But if the gear slot already has a gear in it, then we would need to swap out the gear, and so on and so forth. So this will control the logic for the different interactions with equipping gear. We're going to call this function equip gear, and it's going to take in a gear scriptable object. So the first thing I'm going to do is to get the gear type of the gear and use it to set a reference to the gear int, because this will determine which slot of the gear slots it would go into. And then also I'm going to remove the gear from the inventory. So when we're equipping gear, you notice that we have two slots for upgrade. So we need a special logic for it to make sure that whenever you set in the upgrade, it uses both slots effectively. So we're going to write an if function to check if the gear type is an upgrade type, and then if it is, then we'll do some logic there. So here, if the item is an upgrade type, basically if we check if slot 4 is full, and if it isn't, then the code continues, and since slot 4 is empty, it will just set into slot 4. But if it is full, it will set it to slot 5. And then when the code continues, it checks if slot 5 is empty, and if it is, it sets it in slot 5, and if it isn't, it swaps out slot 5. So this way, the upgrade will always work. It makes sure to default to swapping out the 5 slot whenever you set it, and the 4 slot is left empty. And if the 4 slot is empty, it will set there, and if it's not, it will just swap out the 5 based on if it's empty or not. So that's the logic for that. So now that we've handled the logic for the upgrades, we can just carry on to the regular logic for all of the items. So here, we'll check if the gear slot is currently empty or not before we add the item. And if it's not empty, we'll add the gear slot item back into the inventory. After that, we'll set the gear to the new gear, and then we'll return false or true. So if you notice in this code, we don't actually check if the item can be added back in or not when we do gear slots, because actually, if you recall, all gear of the same category is actually the same size. So if we remove a gear that's 2 by 2 and then add back a gear that's 2 by 2, the inventory system should actually still be able to fit it properly. So we don't actually have to worry about whether it will fit or not because they're all the same size when we swap gear. Actually, this is supposed to be a void. I made a typo earlier. This is supposed to be a void function. So that's the gear functions. One more thing we need to do is in the override menu functions area. So here I'm actually going to add another one. We're actually going to also override the open menu functions because here we want to actually open up the gear menu also. And then of course, when we close the menu, we need to close the gear menu as well. Yeah, we can also cross out this debug log because we don't need it anymore. So whenever we open and close the thing, it should open up the gear menu as well as a tag along, and now it has the gear functions. So if we return back to Unity, we can go back to our menus and down to the gear menu, you'll recall the buttons that we have that are automatically set to not active. And here we will want to go to the onClick function. Yeah, just select all of them. We'll add a new onClick function. We'll reference the menus tab, the inventory system, and we're going to go to unequip gear, the function right here. Then we'll set each button respectively to their ints. So to correspond to all 6 slots in our, as you can see here, our gear slots. We'll also need to set the gear slot UI by taking the buttons and setting them here. Then we'll also need to set the gear menu here, and that's for all of the new functions we need in the inventory system. Next thing we need to do is to set up different tweaks in the inventory system so that we can use the gear functions that we just made. So the first thing we're going to do is that actually when I referred back to Subnautica, I realized I had made a mistake in the coding of the movement stuff. So here, moving items, I actually used the wrong mouse buttons because actually this is right click to move things between inventories, but it actually is supposed to be left click. So we're going to fix that up. So now we're going to change it such that when you right click, it drops the item into the world, and when you left click, it handles both moving to storage and also equipping items. So first up, we need to go here, change this to a 0. Then we need to add a function, an if statement here to check if we're right clicking, because if we right click, we drop the item. So here we're going to need a function to actually drop the item because usually we do it in the move item function, but we need to change that. So we'll make a separate function for dropping items. So I'll come back to this later and add it in once we make the function. So here back in interacting with items, I'm going to go to move item. So down here in move item, I'm just going to go right below it. I'm going to create a new function called drop item so that we can drop the item whenever we right click on it. So first we would need to remove the item, then we would spawn it in the world, and then we check if the item is a tool item, and then we run check hotbar so that we check if the hotbar needs to be updated if we're removing a tool item from the inventory. We can copy paste the spawn in the world code from over here because here we don't need it here anymore. We'll replace this with something else later. Here we'll add in the logic condition such that we only do run check hotbar if the item removed is a tool item instead of just any item removed, then we update the hotbar. It's just to make it more efficient. So we'll take drop item and we'll do it up here. So now that we've separated the drop item function from move item, we can now go back to the move item function and we can add in the functionality for gears. So like equipping and unequipping gear. So we'll need to add some stuff to the move item function. So here we don't want to remove an item first because we already automatically handle removing of items whenever we equip and unequip gear. So we're going to delete this. And also, we only want to equip gear whenever we're not opening us, only when we're in the inventory menu, but like not when we're in a storage menu or anything. So we need to check first if the current menu is this. Then, if the item is gear, then we can attempt to equip the gear, and then if the item isn't gear, then we move on to our regular code. So now, if the current menu is this and the item is gear, then we'll equip the gear. But if the current menu is this and it's not gear, then we don't actually need the function to do anything. So here, if the current menu is not inventory system, that means we're open in a chest or something, in some kind of storage area. So we can just do our regular functions for moving between storages. Lastly, at the check hotbar function, we'll just make sure that the function doesn't run unnecessarily, so we'll just add in that logic from just now. So copy paste. Usually I would have this kind of logic be done within the check hotbar function, but that won't be possible because each time the item is contained within the move item function and whatnot. So in the hotbar function, we don't actually have a reference to the current item. Next up, I'm gonna fix a bug that's actually been in the code for a while. So if you recall, we'll go back to our sorting system. So we have a bunch of functions here that help us to sort the inventory, but we need to go to check if fits. So check if fits is the function that when given an item and a coordinate, it checks if that item can fit in that coordinate. So for example, if you give it a 2x2 item, it checks the coordinate given and then checks the surrounding coordinates to see if it can fit. For example, if we have a 2x2 item and we ask it to go into coordinate, if we ask it to put it in coordinate 3, 4, it'll check if 3, 4 is empty, and then 3 and 3 is empty, and then 4, 4 is empty, and then 4 and 3 is empty, to see if all those are empty, so that to see if it can actually fit in the coordinate shown, because it will take up more than one coordinate space. Here we could generate these extra coordinates that it would take off if it were located in that one specific coordinate, and then check if those coordinates if those coordinates are empty too. However, I made an oversight here. Here we're supposed to check if one of the coordinates is out of bounds, and if it is, then we return false, because if one of the coordinates is out of bounds, then it obviously can't fit into the coordinate we found. And here I only checked for the upper limits of coordinates. So I only checked for the maximum coordinate size. I didn't check if any of the coordinates would be below 0, which, is not going to work. So here I'm just going to add in an extra condition here to check if any of the coordinates is below 0, because if they are, then it's not a valid coordinate either. Otherwise, occasionally you might get an error for an invalid coordinate. So I'm just going to copy paste this statement. I'm going to add another or, and then instead of more than equal grid width, I'm going to do less than 0. So yeah, that was an oversight on my part for the testing, because it's much more likely that a coordinate might accidentally have a negative number instead of a above number, because the sorting goes from top to bottom. So I actually missed that out the first time I made this. So another thing is we need to go to the function avail spot. Because avail spot, sometimes when we put in an item scriptable object, it might actually be a gear scriptable object. So what I'm going to do is, for the check if fits, we just need to set it as an item scriptable object just in case it's accidentally a gear scriptable object. So we're forcing that gear scriptable object to become an item scriptable object just in case it is not an item scriptable object. Otherwise, check if fits will return an error for a wrong item type. Then lastly, for the event that we created earlier, I'm going to go down to sort items, and then whenever we sort the items, we're actually going to call that event that we created on inventory updated, because we want to call this event whenever we sort the inventory. So standard procedure for calling events, you need to check if the event is not null, because if it's null, it will return an error. Yeah, one more thing I forgot. For the prefabs of all of the gear, I forgot to set them to to pick up on the tag pickup. So yeah, you can't forget that one. Haha. So always remember to set the tag. If you want, you can program it into the script, because this is something I often forget to do when I set up uh, new items in this tutorial series. So yeah, you need to have the tag. So you see here we have gear. I can equip it and unequip it. I can drop items, or with left click and right click. So you see some code here. We'll see. You see some bugs here. We'll fix that. We'll get to that in a little while. But as you can see, our tweaks to the inventory system are working with the new left click and right click, as well as the drop item function. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is to add in the functions for the gear, such that when you equip it, well, its functionality will act up, and then when you unequip it, it removes the functionality. It unactivates the functionality. So this will be done differently from tool functionality, because if you recall, tool functionality is directly on the prefab and the game object itself. And since when we equip the gear, we're not actually spawning in any prefabs into the world, we're actually just assigning it to a list, we can't use the same method. What we're going to do instead is to create a universal script for all gear function, and on this script it will decide which gear function to activate based on what is currently assigned to the gear scriptable object list. So in this script we'll need access to the script all the gear scriptable objects. So we'll actually need to have all of our scriptable objects be able to be accessed through the script. And the way we do that is, first we create a new folder and we name it resources. Remember, capital F, capital R. Then I'm going to take all of the scriptable objects and put them in resources. So the thing about resources folder is that it's a special kind of folder, such that you can access the assets inside it from within a script. The next thing I'm going to do is we're going to create the gear universal function script. So if I go over to scripts and then I go over to inventory, I'll create a new folder called gear. And then in this folder, I'll create a new script called gear universal functions. First of all, we will need references to the player controller and the inventory system. I'm also going to add a line up here such that the script will use link. We will need it for one of our functions later. After that, I'm going to create a delegate called gear function. This delegate will be used to store different functions that will turn on and off the different gear functionality. Next, we'll need to get a list of all of the gear scriptable objects, and then we'll need to get a list of all of the different gear functions. So the first one will be an array, because we don't need to edit it ever, because it's going to be gotten directly from our resources folder. And then the second one is a list, because it needs to be changed later. So here I'm going to change start to awake. In awake, we'll have to set up the gear type array. So here we're using the resources.loadAll function, because this function will go to a specific folder, namely the gear folder that's under scriptable objects, and then it will load all of the objects from within there. We also added a type here so that we will only load gear scriptable object items from that folder. Lastly, we did toArray, which is a link function, which will turn this list into the proper gear scriptable object array that gear types is. Next up, I'll set gear functions. So for now, since we don't have any gear functions created in this universal function script, I'll just put a default function. We can ignore the error for now because we haven't created the default gear function, but we will in a minute. And I'll uncomment the line when we do. Lastly, we just need to set the iSystem static variable. The PC variable will actually be set within the player controller itself because if you recall, we set up the the script execution order such that player controller runs later than most other scripts so that it can get all of the other things like the inventory system and whatnot. So we'll be setting the gear universal functions variable via the player controller. So we'll do that later, I'll show you. So next I'm going to delete update for now. Next up, I'm going to create activate gear functions. So this is a function that will be called every time the inventory system is updated, and it will turn on and off the corresponding gear functions based on which gears are activated. The first thing we want to do is to turn off all of the available functions. Don't forget over here, this is supposed to be a small g, not a capital G. So after we deactivate all of the functions that we have, we'll turn on the specific functions for all of the gear that's actually equipped. So here we check if the slot is empty, and if it is, we don't need to do anything. But if it isn't, we will get the index number of the gear scriptable, and then we'll find the same gear function of that index, and we'll turn it on with a true. Then I'm going to make a default gear function. It will just do nothing. And with that, I can uncomment this line. So with that, we have the basics of the gear universal functions. Let's go back to our scene and add it to our game manager. I'm going to add it to menus. The gear types will be set up on start, and so will the gear functions, so we don't actually need to go and set those ourselves. Let's see if it worked. So you see here we have all of the gear functions, and they'll be the default ones. Oh, the gear type didn't set. Let's try that again. Okay, here there's a mistake in the naming of the file. It's actually supposed to be scriptable objects with no space. So you have to be very careful when you put in the file path because it's very exact. Let's try it again. I'll check the menus. So as you can see, we have all of our gear scriptable objects as well. Now that's working, we're going to create the code for the individual gear. So in this episode, we'll do the still suit and code for the flippers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to our gear universal function script. Then I'm going to create a new region for each gear functions that we make. So in the still suit region, we're going to create a couple of variables. Then I'm going to create a item scriptable object water item. Then I'm going to create a bool stored water and a float timer. After that, I'm going to create a float called water generation weight and then a bool called still suit active. So in Subnautica, there is a still suit piece of gear which you can wear, and what it does is actually generate water after a period of time. So basically, they'll have a water generation duration like we have, and they will, after that time has passed, it will generate a bottle of water. So here we're going to create a function called produce water. Basically, the logic is as follows. The timer will increase in regards to real time, and then whenever the timer reaches water generation rate, we'll see if we can add the water to the inventory, and if we can, we reset the timer to 0. But if it can't add the water to inventory, it adds it to stored water. Stored water becomes true, and then the timer is paused until the water can be added to inventory. Now we're going to create another function called add stored water to inventory. What this function does is it checks if there is stored water, and if there is, it tries to put it in the inventory. And if it can put it in the inventory, then it restarts the produce water timer. But if it can't, then the timer remains paused. So whenever we equip the still suit, This function will be added to the onInventory updated event, such that whenever the inventory has a change to it, it'll see we can add in the water, and then that will allow the timer to unpause if there's stored water in the still suit. Then for the last function, I'm going to create the activate still suit function. So this function will basically be one of the gear function delegates in the gear functions list. So here, whenever the skill suit is equipped, we'll add the function to our onInventory updated event, and when it's unequipped, we'll remove the function. However, because of the way we unequipped and equipped our items, we can't always minus equal onInventory updated. So to account for this, we're going to use the try-catch function. So here, if onInventory updated does not have add stored water to inventory, then it will just do nothing. But if it does, then we can remove this function from add stored water to inventory. Before we move on to the flippers, we need to make a few tweaks to the player controller speed bonus system. So going back to Unity, I'll go over to our scripts, player, and then player controller. So while we're at the player controller, let's add in the Gear Universal Functions PC reference. So going to Awake, over here I'll just add the Gear Universal Functions PC instance. Remember, we can't set it in Gear Universal Functions itself because PC runs later than most other scripts. Okay, now that that's done, we can head over to our player movement variable section. So right over here, player movement. In order for us to add more swim bonuses, we're going to add on to the existing system. So instead of just adding numbers to our swim speed bonus and our walk speed bonus, and then minusing them off whenever we don't need them, instead, because of the way Gear Universal Functions work, is that the gear would be minus off more often than it would be added, which would cause us to have a negative swim bonus and cause a lot of errors. So what I'm actually going to do is to create a list to store all of the different swim bonuses we can get. And these will keep track of what bonuses we have currently. After that, we just need to go back to our bonus speed section. So here at our check speed boost function, below the sea glide bonus, we're going to add in some more conditions. So the sea glide bonus will be added and removed based on whether the sea glide is equipped or not, and then we'll also have a for each loop, which will add in every bonus in the swim bonuses list. So this will add in all of the bonuses that we have in a list. Make sure that this is a float. And then we'll copy the same thing for our walking bonuses. So whenever we want to have an item that increases your walk bonus, we can simply just add it to the walk bonuses list, and then it will add into the walk bonus. So this makes it really easy to add and remove different speed bonuses for walking or swimming via the list. So now that we've done that, we can actually go back to Gear Universal Functions and start on the flipper functions. So I'm going to create a new region. Here I just need one variable, a float for the flipper speed bonus. Then I can create a function activate flippers. And then if we are actually removing the bonus, we have to check if the swim bonuses contains the flipper speed bonus. And if it does, we remove the flipper speed bonus. Now that we've created the functions for both flippers and for add stored water to inventory, we can add them to our gear functions. So actually I recall the order in which our scriptable objects are listed, and here we actually only have 4, but the last one would actually be flippers. So here I'm just going to put activate flippers, and actually the second last one is activate still suit, so I'm going to change this one. So with that, whenever we put on the still suit, it should activate the still suit function, and if we create flippers later on, it will activate the flipper function. Last thing we need to do is to actually put produce water function in update. There are going to be some gear that have to be run in update whenever they're active. So we'll just have a list of bools and check. Well, we have a list of ifs, checking if some bools are activated, and then we'll run functions based on if they are. With that, we've created all of the functions for this episode in the Gear Universal function script. So one more thing we need to do before it can work is we need to go back to inventory system. So in inventory system, you recall that we added the event to our sort menu, sort items function. You see we have the on inventory updated event, but we also need to run the gear universal functions whenever we change the equipped gear. So going back to the top, I'm going to go over to the gear slots variables. Here I'm going to make a reference to the gear universal functions. And then after that, I'm going to go over to the equip gear function. Whenever we do equip a gear, we have set gear. What we will do is just activate gear functions. Because this is something that only needs to be run whenever gear is changed, so it's better to run it in the equip gear function rather than in the on inventory updated functions, because otherwise it just clog up the functions. So with that, we can return to the Unity. I'll go over to menus, and here we have the gear scripted menu. So I'm just going to set the water item to a random item we have. The water generation rate, I'll set it at 1 for testing, just so we can see whether it's working or not. And the flipper spin bonus, I'll just put it as. And then up here in inventory system, I'll set the gear universal functions to the gear universal function. So let's click play and see if our code is working. So you see we have the 4 different gear scriptable objects we made, and then the gear functions we made. So I'm going to pick up the different gear that we have, and then I'm going to equip this. So you see that is the still suit, and the still suit is now active. So if I return to the game in real time and I wait a few seconds, you'll see that we've had deodorant added to our game. So yeah, we had the item added. So you see it just keeps creating more every second. And if I wait a couple of seconds, or enough seconds, pick up some items, you see that our inventory is full. So you see it stopped adding items to our inventory, but then if we remove it, it added it back. Then it'll just keep trying to add them until it can't anymore. So you see it added it back, and then the timer restarted. And if we did have the flipper item, I was unable to find actually a free asset to act as the flippers, but I can assure you that it would work if we had the flipper item, that the speed would increase. So that's everything for this episode of creating an underwater survival game like Subnautica. Unfortunately, this will be the last episode. We're currently unable to continue the series, so this is actually the finale episode. I hope that the series helped you, and have a good day. If you want to support our channel, you can help us by becoming a patron, because this will give you access to project files for all of our tutorials, as well as Patreon exclusive posts on the blog. So any support you give will go a really long way. Right now, we're not making as much money back as we are putting into the content creation. So if you donate, we'll be able to make this a long-term and more sustainable endeavor. See you in the next video.